Yeah, having a lighthouse keeper in my family was certainly added another dimension to it. Even now, when I sort of say to people my father was a lighthouse keeper, it attracts an incredible amount of attention. My memories of being on the lighthouse comes from the photo albums. It doesn't come from actual real life. I was too young, but I do know that Mike's attitude towards life, that he's really sort of a pragmatic sort of a character, and that sort of attitude would have really suited lighthouse life, because from what I know of lighthouse life, it was very much, suited jack of all trades type people, and he was a really hands-on sort of guy.
I met Mike when I was working at Kaitaia Hospital. I was looking after one of the staff who'd come down from Cape Reinga Lighthouse, and then I was invited back to go up there, so of course I did that. And one night someone said, "Oh, Mike Lloyd's coming tomorrow, you'll like him." 3 months later, we had a wonderful wedding up at Cape Reinga. Brilliant weather, turkeys from the Hauhora pub, tauroas from 90 Mile Beach. The keepers and their families put on a splendid feast for us, all prepared by themselves, and just ideal for the many guests we had.
Mike actually died of motor neuron disease, and we scattered the ashes up at Cape Reinga, which is where they got married. And the rest of this story is mainly about the last few years of Mike's life, and talks about kind of how Mike and Sue approached the onset of this terminal illness. Yeah, so after they got married, Mike and Sue went down to Cape Brett. This was Mike's first permanent lighthouse keeping position. Prior to that, he was a relieving lighthouse keeper, opposed to the kind of man-alone myth of the lighthouse keeper. As far as I know, in New Zealand, there was only all but one lighthouse. You had to actually be married to have a permanent position, and there was more than one lighthouse keeper.
Most of the children were born while we were lighthouse keeping, but later on we came ashore, and as the children grew up and dispersed around the countryside, we felt it was better to leave Northland and move to Hamilton, which was much more accessible for everyone.
After working for a few more years in Hamilton, Mike and Sue were going to retire and buy a piece of land out in the country somewhere and just have a few animals running around and a few fruit trees, of course a veggie garden, and they were just going to live a sustainable lifestyle. Shortly after moving to Hamilton, Mike had a job as caretaker for a local school, and he always said that this job was one of the best he ever had, which I always thought was interesting. And the first sign of something actually being wrong was when Mike stumbled putting rubbish in a sort of a bin at school and found he couldn't lift his toes when his heel was on the ground. A sports doctor consulted immediately thought it was neurological, but couldn't diagnose any particular disorder. And a while after the toe incident, Mike found running became impossible, but he still had no diagnosis. He got quite frustrated with not knowing, and also a burning sensation started in his feet. And although this wasn't painful, this and his failing strength eventually caused him to stop work at the school. And after a period of around 1 year, motor neuron disease was diagnosed.
And the first thing he said to me was, "Go and get the books, the medical books, look up about it." Because I was a nurse, I had access to the nurse's library, and he was waiting in the car for me, and I went up and got 4 books. And I remember opening one of them. There was a paragraph about 2 sentences long, and it said, "Poor prognosis, maybe 2 years." And I still remember my stomach just sort of dropping,
yes,
the sort of knot in the stomach hit me. Anyway, he'd asked for the books, so there was nothing I could do about that. So we went home, and I gave him the books, and I went to make lunch. And he started laughing, and I turned round and he said, "I've only got 2 years to live." And he was just laughing because he couldn't believe it.
So the first thing Mike did after he was diagnosed was to get home and build a ramp, of course. And the funny thing was, the first ramp he did was a concrete one that came straight down out of the front door, and it was at about 45 degrees. And I would have loved to have seen a wheelchair going down that ramp. But he saw that as well, and he built this beautiful wooden ramp. It had a balustrade put on it, and it worked really well. He also made improvements in the garden to make it easier for Sue to maintain. When his legs were really weak, he was using the wheelbarrow as an actual walking frame.
One of the things he did need to talk about in the earlier days after diagnosis was his funeral. He wanted the arrangements for that all sorted out. And being Mike Lloyd, he would not spend a cent more on himself that was absolutely necessary. There was a firm in town making coffins that you could go and buy for yourself, and he sent me out to buy one, a kit set coffin. Mm-hmm. And I got this thing and brought it home, and then I said, do you think I better get one for me? And he gave me such an odd look. It wasn't in the program for me to be dying.
As Mike's muscles continued to weaken, he made himself a walking stick, and he used that for a while and then progressed to a walking frame for several months until around about sort of 15 months from diagnosis, he had to be in an electric wheelchair from then on. He didn't actually have the strength in his arms to use a manual one.
We carried on making homebrew for a long time, and I used to obviously have to do more and more of it, like putting the bottle caps on.
Yeah.
He didn't have the strength in his hands to do that, and we worked really well together, and eventually I was doing the whole job when he couldn't get out there. But we used to go out there with a long flex on the phone and so forth in case it rang or he wanted to put a bet on.
In the bedroom was the first sort of changes they had to make, and because obviously as Mike's legs were weakening, he couldn't pull himself out of bed, and so they had various apparatus to help him do that and things to hang on to when he was getting dressed. I think they actually screwed a chair into the wall, sort of thing like that he could hang on to as he was getting dressed. And then there was the radio. You'll see that in just about every photo with Mike. There'll be a radio nearby. That was, of course, so he could listen to the All Blacks in the middle of the night. Yeah, which is something we used to do. It was really interesting photographing Mike because he wasn't somebody who was normally comfortable with being photographed. So for him to actually give me sort of this permission and just be totally comfortable with me photographing him in just about every place around the house, I found totally amazing.
As Mike needed more assistance with different things that he wanted to be able to do, I would go out into the garage and stare around thinking, what could I use out of all this equipment here to help him? The bath was taken out, and that made space to turn the chair around so he could be wheeled up into the shower with a little tiny ramp. And also the shelves under the hand basin were cut out so that he could wheel up to it, get his feet under the hand basin. Because it was his legs weakening first, his hands and arms were all right for quite a long time. We had soap on a rope so that in the shower he could reach it anywhere if he dropped it, which would easily happen. He could find it again. Another thing he had was a rope tied round the handle of the kitchen door, and he could come through the door, put his hand back, but you can see all the scrapes on the door from where he scraped it with his wheelchair. Not easy. He used to say he'd had a brilliant life, often said he'd had a brilliant life. He'd had a terrific family, wonderful children. And, he eventually managed to think I was quite a good wife. I'm sure he doubted that at times when we were all younger and I was screaming at the kids. We'd done it in so many ways. I'd helped him in the shower. I'd washed his bottom when he could stand up, but he couldn't at the same time wash it. It developed to washing all over in the shower. And then we got to the stage where he couldn't pull himself up out of the chair to be washed, and we couldn't really use the shower anymore. The bathroom was quite cold, and he said, "Don't worry, we'll have a wash at the kitchen sink." And that's what we did for a long time. I washed him at the kitchen sink, and I'd put the roasting dish on his lap, and he'd tuck his head down, I'd wash his hair, never spilt any drops. See, Mike was so undemanding. For one thing, he never wanted to go out anywhere. He would not go in his wheelchair down the road and put his bets on. I think it made him feel very vulnerable being in a wheelchair. And I said, "Look, I'll come with you, But it was just for people to see him in a wheelchair. He couldn't bear it. He got round the section. But he said that if he had to face a long-term disability that was not terminal, he would have made himself go. I didn't think it was worth it. And he was never depressed. He could do everything he wanted to do. He had a phone account, he could put his bets on, he had all the information he wanted. And that was the main reason he would have gone out. But he was never a person to go out for a drive or anything.
Yeah, at Christmas, and as with most other Christmases, our family tried to just gather for at least a couple of days at that time. This was the first Christmas with Mike in the wheelchair, but from my memories, it all seemed to go like any other Christmas, really, with the usual array of present giving and a traditional Christmas meal. We didn't know it at the time, but this was our last Christmas with Mike.
He did help to stand and turn and sit down in a different chair. We had a turntable under his feet, and he would, so that if I pulled him up, he'd be standing on that, and then to turn him, he didn't have to move his feet because he often couldn't move them. And so the turntable would turn his feet while I turned the rest of him, and we got quite crafty at that. And then later on, as his legs weakened more, he couldn't always keep his feet on the turntable. And I got one of his leather belts, and I used to strap his ankles together. It gives you a very weird feeling to strap somebody's ankles together, because you do that to dead people. You tie their ankles together when they go off on the gurney. And I never mentioned that to him. It was very difficult for him to hold it between his legs. The bottles are quite fat. So we had a little mechanism that we had a bit of hose, a suitable diameter, and a bottle, the neck of a bottle, and diverting into another hose. And the other end of the hose went down into a bucket, a flagon. And we stood it in a bucket with sand in it so it wouldn't make a noise. And he used to use that, and it was very efficient. Pinned it to his pants so that it wouldn't fall out of his reach. It was highly comic. And the first time we used it, the cat heard this tittle, tittle, tittle in the corner, and rushed over to investigate what's going on in that bucket,
Mike was never really interested in eating. He was someone who sort of ate to live rather than lived to eat. I remember him cooking up lovely Sunday roast when we were young and having sort of toast and Marmite in the middle of the night when we were listening to the All Blacks, but he was more interested in having a beer. He was drinking his home brew up to the last 2 or 3 months before he died.
Probably for the last 2 to 3 months, he was eating like a sparrow. He would drink, but he wouldn't eat more than maybe a slice of bread and something on it during the day, and a bit of fruit. I've never known whether it was deliberate starvation or not, but I don't think so. I think he just couldn't handle it. But effectively, he did really starve. He didn't really die of the MND so much as the starvation. He wouldn't have weakened so quickly if he'd been better nourished. And it was quite hard for him at first to trust it, but it was necessary, and it does, a day, and you're used to it. Once you get the feel of it and feel confident, it's okay. But it's a hang of a thing to handle around the house. It really is. And a lot of people find it very difficult to have hospital equipment in their homes. They can't bear it. They've turned their house into a hospital. We never felt like that about it. And I can remember the OT saying, thank goodness you're flexible people. You don't mind having this equipment. It doesn't upset you.
Sue has talked to me about the photos taken during Mike's illness, and in those conversations subsequent to the photos being made, Sue has shown real gratitude towards the images as they remind her not of her husband with a terminal illness, but rather a time of real closeness between the two of them. Whereas I've found making the photographs has given meaning to something I couldn't really comprehend at the time.
Well, I'm such a practical person, we just got on with it. And because there was one thing I really valued was there was so much I could do to help him, more and more. He had to accept that help. And that was the first time in our marriage that he would ever accept my help with anything. Mostly we couldn't work together, we couldn't do jobs together because he would not accept anybody's help. He wouldn't accept the children's help. So we really got much closer during this time than we ever had been. And he began to say to people, how lucky he was to have Sue, and he said it to me too. We didn't get the hospital, we should have got it sooner. And when we realised, because we wanted to go on sleeping together, but I used to have to get up 4 or 5 times a night to help him turn, that was okay. I always got enough sleep. He used to take some very mild pain relief just to relieve discomfort at night so that he would get enough sleep. Otherwise we'd have been up 9 or 10 times. He really needed to have an electric bed that he could raise and lower the head of it and the foot of it when he felt that need. You can do it to such a minimal amount, but it's a big help for the comfort. So when the time came, we rang up the firm that we knew supplied them, and that's when we discovered there was a 4-week wait for delivery, and they came and measured you up. So we'd had no idea that we would have had to wait. So he actually only had it for 3 weeks before he died. He was always able to lift a mug himself. He had that contracture in his hands, and it made his 3 smaller fingers sort of curl in towards his palm, and because of that he was always able to slip them through the handle of a particular mug and lift it and drink. He never got so weak that he couldn't do that. And the day before he died he was sitting up doing his crossword. But that last few weeks was quite hard once he was in that bed, and I did have to get help from a hospice nurse to wash him because it was just taking too long, because he was so paralysed by then. It was just taking too long and he would be getting too cold. So I needed some help to turn him, wash him, and we just did it between us. And we settled him down for the night, and I remember saying, "You okay?" And he just lifted his hand to indicate okay. We went to sleep, and then I woke up in the night waiting for him to want his pain relief. And I was just listening to him breathing. And then I just heard this little rattle, and he was gone. I just got there in time to speak to him, and he was gone in his sleep. Yeah, it'd be about 3 o'clock in the morning.
I remember getting the call at around 7:30 in the morning, and also that the drive home through the desert road was really amazing. And that night also the All Blacks suffered their largest defeat ever in a midweek game in Australia. I still feel Mike's death is somehow implicated in that. I wasn't there to actually help put Mike into his coffin, but when Sue and my sister came to do it, he was too long, and they actually had to take his shoes off to fit him in.
We did have a funeral celebrant come to help us because I thought we might get stuck at some stage. She helped us, came and helped us to, before we'd put Dad in the car to take him, we stood round the bed and said goodbye to him. And she helped us do that because I could imagine that we might just sort of seize up. And she had rung up the crematorium and arranged a time that we had to be there. And, we had to be there at that time. It was a half-hour slot.
The trip to the crematorium was really quite memorable. The coffin sort of sticking out of the back of the larder and then missing the turn-off to the cemetery and having to turn around. And once we'd delivered Mike's coffin, my brothers throwing wads of cash on the desk to settle the bill. Sue wondered afterwards if we'd actually had enough ceremony involved, but that actually came when we scattered Mike's ashes at Cape Reinga about three or 4 months later.
We wrote to friends at Te Hapua to see if it would be okay, because we would not have done it without Maori sanctions, that it was okay. No way I would have done it behind their backs.
Yeah.
Would have felt wrong. We all travelled up to Te Hapua with Mike's ashes, and we got there, and I remember us sitting round the big kitchen table there, and Bub saying, "Bring Mike in," because I'd left the ashes in the car, like a Pākehā would. Bring him in, and he had his chair, and his ashes were put on his chair. But they could not. They had asked me, was I going to bring a minister with me? And I said, no, I didn't think so, because we were just going to do it as a family. But they couldn't cope with that. They had their own right and a minister, and he actually came and did this funeral rites round the table, and then he was a bit worried in the morning because we were going to go up first thing in the morning before the tourists arrived to scatter the ashes, and he was a bit bothered because he had to get away to some meeting or other, and I said, look, we need to be there really early. So he was happy with that. He came up and made his little speech, and then we all scattered them. Pride goes before a fall, but I didn't expect him to fall. He learnt his lesson with courage and grace. He said to me, it's like facing a firing squad. But it wasn't like that. He couldn't speak, but raised his hand, slept and died. Just time to say, my darling chap. Then he was gone. Now he's a son of the land, born near Rotorua, scattered at the Cape, a life completed in style. Afterwards, sadness and calm, tears, reflections, many friends, achievement. Fancy dying in a place like this.